philosophy without discussing its context, what's going on in the world of technology, what's going on in the world of politics, what's going on in the world of social changes is relevant to the philosophy. They're always connected. So I found a book this week which I highly recommend. It's unique. It's called The Origins of Sex, but it's got nothing to do with it. It's not a sexy book. It's written by a senior fellow at Oxford, and he's traced the attitudinal changes to sex in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it is an astonishing read. It's an astonishing read. If you read it, lots of stuff that I've told you from ancients through to medievals will click into place for you, because you'll see how attitudes have changed. He makes the point that before modernity, women were considered to be the sexy ones. You know, men were reasonable. Men concerned themselves with intellectual matters, and women were the fleshy ones. They were the ones who were, interested in bodily things. And it was only really with the development of, even long before women had the vote, but when there was a printing press and the novel developed, a lot of these novels were written by women. And so a women's point of view started to become in the airspace, and the whole attitude of that changed. Also, prior to modernity, sexual behaviour was never ever considered to be a private matter. That belongs to modernity. And that's the most amazing switch in history. Before that, sexual behaviour was a public matter, and it drew a public response. I think I've told you a couple of stories, but this book really spells it out really well. I can't say the man's name. Derrida, what are the...
He was on, I saw him speak at the weekend live.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
And he's still his name?
Well, everyone's referred to him as Sparrow. He's at the Sydney Writers Festival. He was on Q&A this last one.
I missed him.
It was fantastic.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, Rick.
And he's still his name?
Last name is D-A-B-H-O-Y-W-A-L-A. It's called The Origins of Sex. It's only published this year. It's a Penguin. So it won't be hard to get it.
Yeah. Last question.
Yeah.
And it's in these days of, at the moment, the so-called debate about orientation, some places where women are stoked for being, quote, authors, etc.
Yeah.
It seems tough. Please help me understand what they mean by it was more public back then.
We're talking about Western philosophy, okay?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is the attitudes that you currently see on the news from Muslim societies were exactly the attitudes we had only a couple of years ago. It was exactly the same in this culture. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, we are inclined to see some of these news items and get very on our high horse. How could these people be so primitive? But just a blink of an eye ago, that was our society as well. Okay, you ready to go? By tonight, by the way, we'll be done. We will have done the whole history of Western philosophy in 4 weeks. I am reasonably satisfied that I have given you a reasonable overview so that you will have seen the forest without getting stuck in the trees, if you know what I mean. So I think when you start reading any part of philosophy, you really do need a sense of the overall, because no matter where you pick up, it's easy to just get completely lost in it. So that's the value of what we've done over 4 weeks. Tonight is the finish, and the next 2 weeks is entirely given over to one author, Martin Buber, who happens to be my favourite, which is why we're doing it. And if you don't like it, what are you going to do? Yeah, you want to
fire.
Yeah. So, sack me, you know. Guy has, I think, everybody's email. Is that true? Because if Guy doesn't have your email, this is Guy at the back, can you give him your email tonight? Because you will get much more out of the next 2 weeks if you read the text that we're about to email to you. It's not particularly arduous. For next week, I'm giving you a little bit from the start of a book and a slice from the middle of the book. And for the following week, I'm giving you a slice from the end of the book. And I had to scan this out of my own personal book, so a lot of the text is marked. I should never do that. You just have to ignore that. Ignore notes, anything like that. Just have a go at reading the words and see where you get. If we don't have fun in the next 2 weeks, there'll be something seriously wrong. Also, for the next 2 weeks, there will be tea and coffee and nibbles there from 6. So, you know,
Getting us interested.
Come early and have fun. And if you have questions, you know, that'll be a good time to do it. Between 6 and 7, I'll be here. You know, we'll have fun. Okay. So tonight, what we're doing is that period that follows all of this, which we call modernity. I can't help coughing. I have this lung condition called bronchiectasis. And so I don't even know I cough. I don't really know I've done it, except if I'm being interviewed on the radio and I see someone's face go, I must have coughed. It's good for the prayer life of my doctor because she puts a stethoscope on and goes, oh God, oh God. I want to I'll talk about the 2 wars. Before I get there, can you see that, for me, what's important in our overview is when you see the shifts. You know, when we leave Plato and go beyond Plato, you can see how the elevation of the rational and philosophy came to be about knowledge rather than wisdom. That was an important shift. When we left that and, you know, it shifted again in medieval period, and then when it shifted into modernity, we shifted to the self. And the ideal in modernity was for us to live an autonomous life. Two Greek words, auto, nomos. You know these words. Auto, you have an automatic car, it self-changes. Auto is self. Nomos is law. If somebody's nominally something, then they're legally something. So autonomous means law unto yourself. So the virtue that comes in this modern period, there's big exceptions of course, but as a general statement, is the emergence of a culture where you are a law unto yourself. I think, therefore I am. What's my ground for certainty is that I think, therefore I am. That's how my philosophy begins. So it's about me. And even as these guys are losing faith in reason, when we get to the existentialists and we're losing faith in reason now, it's even more so about me. Because now I have to be an authentic person is the ideal of an existentialist. Does that make sense? So we're kind of shrinking down our frame of reference.
What you help me understand what was like before all of that?
Yes, it's tribalism and community, for better and for worse. And you know, where we started tonight was, you know, sexual offences were communal things that were attracted communal punishment because there was nothing private. So, you know, you could make a good argument that modernity did a good thing for us, but my point only is that our frame of reference has shrunk down to the person. That's all. For better or for worse. So, when I arrived at Wayside, people used to say to me all the time, what we want to help people do is to become autonomous people. And in my view, that's the problem, not the answer. The problem is when you become a law unto yourself. You know, you have the final word on all matters. You are the expert. You know, that's the problem. And the people who are damaged, rich or poor, they usually do have the final word on everything. When we were building this building, you should have seen how many experts knew how to build this building and how the builders were all wrong. And my uncle's got a grader and we could come around here and do this for half the price. It's a sign of damage. I would say, and we're almost jumping into next week a little bit, but you know, the things that I say around here often is that that we don't want Wayside to be an ICU. This is not an intensive care unit where you walk in and state what your needs are and we try and meet them all. We're not running an intensive care unit. We're running an ICU. Does that make, you know, you cannot have a sense of gratitude to be alive. You cannot, you can't have this sense of I have a gift unless you see a giver. And when your frame of reference is this wide, then you'll never see a giver. And you know, all you see is sources of stuff. And what preoccupies you is how do I get the maximum stuff for the minimum price? Well, that's actually the whole community. There's nothing unusual about people who come to Wayside in that way. The preoccupation of how do I get the maximum stuff for the minimum price is where we've gone, so that I think I said before, the shift that has happened is we used to live in a society, now we live in an economy. We used to be citizens, now we're consumers. And oh, sorry, can you hear the narrowing down there? Yeah.
The question is, are you? It's a question and also a supposition. Are you describing capitalism in rich countries like this now?
Yes, without doubt. That's exactly what we're doing. I'll come back to you in a minute. Yeah, Rick?
I just think that there must be some currents in modernity that recognise the limitations and illusions about autonomy of self and stuff, and
yes,
and shaping influences, not necessarily controlling and shaping influences as well. There must be some.
There is, Rick. And a major thing that I left out of here, which I'm just trying to spare you the pain, is a thing called phenomenology. Remember when I said, once you get to Descartes, this is my artistic, and Descartes doesn't, from Descartes on, knowing becomes about the content of the head, and the connection between the object and the knower is kind of severed. What do you know when you say you know that? Well, the answer from modernity is you know your idea of chair. That's what happened in modernity. In phenomenology, which is almost the beginning of where we are tonight, you lose contact with both knower and object. Now, the reason I spared you all this is that the guy who kicked this off is a guy called Heidegger, and a German philosopher, and he was a Nazi, and I can't convince myself that he meant what he wrote. I just can't. That's a tad arrogant of me to say that, just a smidge arrogant.
He must have known.
Well, when I first...
He wrote the book himself, he must know what he wrote.
Yeah, oh, sure. Sure he does. Don't kid yourself that everybody who writes a book...
That's the thing, someone said he didn't mean it. You can't say he didn't mean it, he wrote it.
I'll agree with that he wrote it. He writes in such a dense way that when you first read him, you think, I must be the dumbest bloke that ever lived, because I don't get a word of this. And then you read it again, because you have to, and you think, maybe there's something here, I can't see it. And then you read it again, and by the fourth time you read this, you think, this actually doesn't make sense.
Challenge the reader.
Yeah. I'll tell you, where we're going right now is that we've really got to a point in philosophy where there really is a conviction that if you say something rational, you offend against wisdom. You offend against wisdom. That is one of the characteristics of postmodernity. Postmodernity really comes to us after the war. Let me just remind you of a couple of little facts. Firstly, the First War. The First World War had a much bigger impact on Australia than the Second. I think I can say that pretty confidently. In 1914, Australia had a population of 4.5 million. It's funny, isn't it? 4.5 million. 61, or just under 62,000 deaths out of 4.5 million. Now, years ago, I haven't done this again recently to check that I'm right, but just give me a bit of license. I did a calculation once based on state figures and against the number of available men of fatherable age that could have gone to that war. And then you come up with a figure of in the order of 40% of all men who are available to be fathers went to that war. And then 64% of those didn't come back. And the ones who did come back came back 5 years later and couldn't say a word to anybody. Because what they'd lived through was not expressible. You couldn't talk about it. So they tended to be, the fathers that we did get back, tended to be either monsters or helpless little boys. One or the other.
A lot of happy faces.
Very much so. Very much so. And the society changed because we now have women doing what used to be men's jobs. And these guys came back. They were told in the First World War that they would come back to a country fit for kings. And we gave them a lot of soldier settlements. Are you aware of that? Which turned out to be unviable little pieces of land where they came and broke their hearts trying to make a fruit block or something work, and it was a disaster. It was just a disaster.
So they were crucified twice.
Indeed they were. And they couldn't talk about it.
In the First World War, some of the old soldiers who in the cavalry, they were told before they left the war to shoot their own horses.
Yeah, that's right.
This lady said that was my grandfather.
Yep.
And the old story was, this is from my whānau too,
Yeah.
which is married from my extended family.
Yeah.
It was brutally savage when they were told to kill beasts that looked after them.
Yeah.
We used to get the
Alive.
for
Yeah. Yeah.
My grandfather managed to give it to an Arab guy. So he ended up fighting alongside most of Derrida.
Yeah.
So it was very, very nice.
Yeah.
But it was horrendous.
The more you look into it, the more horrendous it gets. It is the most amazing history, full of unspeakable suffering. And I'm fairly familiar with the actual battles, but if you ever read about the First World War, and Australia's part in it. Sorry?
It's heartbreaking.
It's unbelievable. And in the battle that they called Passchendaele, which in my view is probably one of the worst, they had to take a forest before they got to this place called Passchendaele. And you see photos, and there's a forest, and then after the battle, there is nothing. There's little sticks this high coming out of the ground where a forest used to be. And, you know, there were people, we had this phenomenon called shell shock. And even when I was a boy in early high school, my father used to take me to the Soldiers' War Memorial Hospital, visiting people, and there were still guys from the First War shaking under beds from shell shock. That's pretty amazing. So I call that period the death of glory. Now, don't put too much weight in it because I just made it up. But the soldiers, the whole country was encouraged into that war by saying it was going to be a glorious event. And there was talk about the glory of battle, and it really came from previous wars when you'd have a sword and you'd go in and fight somebody. And it had nothing to do with this mechanised machine gun stuff that would shoot down columns in one hit. So I call it the death of glory, but it's kind of naivety in the extreme. When you hear the songs that the soldiers sang on their way in, it was all going to be over tomorrow. You know? But wait until the boys from Australia get here and we'll sort you out. And then they walked into hell. And which is partly why these guys couldn't speak, the ones who did come back, forever after. And so they formed these clubs, well, they were cell clubs, where they get blind and lean on each other. And that was their only support. So what I'm saying is,
why wouldn't you, if you were in their position, why wouldn't you?
Perfectly reasonable. Perfectly reasonable. Also, too, not that anybody really talks about it much, but if you read some of the history after the First World War, most of the kind of really nasty social evils, crime, happened through old soldiers. But old soldiers had this respect because they were old soldiers, but they were also poor, merry hell, and they were guys who'd given up on everything. Also, too, following the 1418 war, what we got was the Roaring Twenties, which was who gives a shit about your social conventions. And so women's dresses that went from ankles to up here, and we used to only bathe on separate beaches before that war. Then after the war, it was who gives a shit. And there used to be all around Sydney nitrous oxide parties, which is what the dentist, I get it for a checkup. This nitrous oxide is great stuff. But those parties all around Sydney, and it was all just a part of nothing that we held sacred matters and just let it rip. Yep.
It wasn't just the First World War either, it was the influenza epidemic which did the same all over again.
That's right. In fact, I've got numbers here, but I'm not going to bore you with how many figures then died of disease, which is just astonishing. Well, that's another question. That was another, don't talk about it, but there's a lot of guys who got the clap in Egypt when they were over there, and they were disgraced forever, But that's another story. So I used to believe that Australia had the highest percentage of casualties in that war, and that isn't true. We had a little short of 1.5% of our population lost to death, and then we had another 150-odd thousand more than that wounded. And if you got wounded in the First War, there are books around that can show you this. The bullets in those days didn't pierce you through and go out the other side, take half your face off. And we're talking serious kind of wounds. It's like in the American Civil War, which we've got nothing to do with tonight, the bullets used to travel slow. So if you got hit in the limb, you lost your limb. And I've seen photos, in the early glass photos, of surgeons who would be cutting off limbs, and there'd be the surgeon's tent, and outside the tent was all this pile of limbs. So that was your only choice. And if you got hit in the torso, It was all over that. The soldier would ask you to lay down and fold the arms. There's all these pictures of guys with their arms folded, ready to die. There's nothing for it. If you've got to get here, it's all over. England lost 2.2% of their population, their whole population. So we're talking just under 1 million soldiers dead in that war when they had a population of 45 million. You know, it's pretty. France lost 4.29, 4.3 of their population gone. That's 4 and a bit million, 4.3 million people gone. I can tell you Germany. By the way, little countries that got sucked into this, like Serbia, 16.11% of the population gone. Think about us losing 16% of our population. Think what would that mean?
That's our adult population, but that's what we use there.
Yeah, that's right. These are people who should have been fathers and so on, and should have finished their study and gone on to be engineers and all that. They didn't.
Part of the room, you're dead.
Yeah. Germany, 3.8% of their population, which is 2.5 million people dead, with another 4.5 million injured in the First War. No. The Turks copped this, the poor Turkish people, which is the Ottoman Empire, but the Turks, had a population of 21 million, and they lost just under 3 million, which is 13.72% of their people, to death, and another nearly 500,000 injured. You know, and we think the First World War knocked us around a bit, and it did. But, you know, it had an effect on every part of the culture. You know, Protestant ministers, the Catholics were not all that happy about the First World War. And we had 3 ballots about conscription, and it was a fight to the death. And the Catholic Archbishop opposed it. But the Protestant ministers and Protestant churches were all wildly in favour that people be conscripted to go to this war. They were lost, partly because the soldiers themselves voted against it. They didn't want anyone but volunteers out here. So the Protestant ministers before the First World War, the churches suddenly filled. And all these Protestant ministers were saying, this is going to be your baptism of fire. This is going to make our country. You know, go out there, and you remember we've got all this naive jingoism, and the boys from Australia are going to get it. Then we got completely slaughtered. Guess who delivered the telegram that said, your boy is gone? Protestant ministers. So, who wanted to see the Protestant minister going up the street? Absolutely no one. It was such a dumb move. Anyway. So, the First World War, I called the glory. Let's move along because I don't want to get too stuck about this. In the Second World War, the population in Australia at the time, in 1939, was just under 7 million, and total deaths to Australia was 40,000, which is 0.5% of our population. So you can see it's much smaller. Also, too, the Second World War kind of redeemed the idea